Joining me now is Megan Hayes, former special assistant to President Biden and former director of message planning. Welcome back to the show. And we keep bringing you back, Megan, for a number of reasons, not least of which is you know President Biden and his team very well. What are the conversations likely happening now? What does President Biden need to hear to choose whether or not to leave the race? And do you think he would direct then his delegates to support the vice president?
So I think that the president's made it clear that he's not leaving the race. So what I think that the conversations are happening in Rehoboth, I think he's recovering from COVID and probably resting and doing what people do when they're sick. And then I also think that they're plotting out where he's going to go on the campaign trail and what he's going to do moving forward in the battleground states that he's doing. And I think they're probably looking at the polling and the analytics and making sure that they're hitting all the spots that they need to and making sure that they are touching on the polls. We just came out of the Republican convention where they, introduced more MAGA extreme policies that the president feels very strongly about and the ticket can counteract. So I think that that's probably what they're working on now. And I do think if he were to step aside and make that decision, a different decision than he's already made, then yes, I do think he would support the vice president.
Can I ask you, do you think he's just fuming? Do you think he's ticked off? Some reporting has suggested that. Or do you think he's hurt, or both, by all these calls, now 36 publicly, including people that he would think are his allies, 36 calls for him to, within Congress, Democratic members of Congress, to leave the race, and others saying, well, look, I mean, we could do this, we could do that, we'd support an open primary or support Kamala Harris, this, that, and the other. Is he hurt? Mad? What's he like with this?
The president is notorious for not holding grudges, so I'm not sure that he's holding a grudge. I'm sure he's also a very loyal person, so I'm sure it's a little, it's a little bit hard to swallow. But I'm sure he's mad and upset all at the same time. But he knows that he made a mistake at the debate, and he knows he had a bad performance, and he knows that he has to go out there and prove to not only voters but his colleagues that he, can do the job for another 4 years. So I think that the president is probably taking it all in stride, but I think he's focused on beating Donald Trump. I mean, that's what we need to be doing in November, and not really focused on what he's going to be doing, if he's going to step aside and who we should support. I think that Democrats need to coalesce together and turn the focus to Donald Trump.
What about the people surrounding him, though? I mean, we've heard multiple times that he has a very tight, very loyal, you say he values loyalty, of course. He's got a loyal group that's going to be there to support him. In their support of him, are they saying, look, that debate sucked. You really dug yourself a massive hole, and you've got to get out of it. Does he know the reality of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. People are reporting as if the president lives in a bubble and doesn't have a phone and doesn't watch TV and doesn't talk to people outside of these few advisors. He very much is a consumer of news. He very much is a person who lives on planet Earth. He knows what happened, at the debate was not good for him. He totally understands that. And they are working towards getting out there. He's been to the battleground states. He's talking to voters. It's the folks that are working around him and the tight circle around him are advising him now on what to do to move forward. They're talking to him about what states to go to, what counties they need to go to, what policies they need to be talking about, what's really important to voters here. And, elections happen on the ground, and the campaign has over 1,000 employees on the ground talking to voters every day. And that's what people are focused on here. They're not focused. The team isn't focused on whether or not he should drop out and all this other swirl about a mini primary. Like it's very clear he's made his decision, and now they're focused on beating Trump.
Okay. Speaking of not living up to expectations, or at least hopes, let's talk about former President Trump's rambling speech to the Republican convention, 92 minutes long. Politico wrote after his remarks, the initial ones on the shooting, the rest of his speech did not reflect a single authentic note of reflection, not a hint that he had given a moment's thought to a wider, more profound message for the American people. How much of a gift was his return to his typical Trumpian rhetoric and lies for Democrats?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's reminding voters and reminding the public what a Trump presidency looked like and what another 4 years will look like. I mean, if I was the Biden campaign, which I think they're doing, is they're highlighting all of these things that he said and the reality show that was their convention. So I think, it is a gift for Democrats. It's reminding voters, it's reminding these independent voters what they have to look forward to if they do vote for Donald Trump.
Can I ask you very quickly how much a difference a speech like that can make?
I mean, I think that it's endless possibilities here. The lies that he told, the crazy MAGA extreme views, all the different things. They can make ads. They actually really do impact independent voters. I mean, I think you guys saw focus groups there after that people were like, oh, I would have voted for him, but now I'm not going to. So I do think these things all matter, and it all adds up. And we still have 3.5 months for people to really get to know Donald Trump again and to reevaluate their, to see where they're going to vote.
Okay, Megan Hayes, look forward to seeing you again soon. I appreciate the candid conversation.